everyone, and welcome to the Wigtown Book Festival. My name is Stuart Kelly. I'm a writer and critic, and it's a pleasure to be here today with Charles Spencer to discuss The White Ship. A friend and I have an ongoing game called The Never Was King, where we try and make up the stories about all the people, such as the son of Henry VIII, or the eldest son of James VI, or George II's son, George III's father, and all the people that didn't become king. And this book is an astonishing analysis of a pivotal moment in British history, English history, European history. It involves a spectacular boat sinking. And it involves somebody's plans for how this various conglomeration of France, England, even parts of Scotland might come together. I found it fascinating, and I didn't know much about it. Certainly, we have had a period in which, between 1066 and Magna Carta, we don't really know much of that history. So it's a really wonderful resource in terms of what that period was like and what was at stake. As I say, I think it's a remarkable book. Charles, it's a delight to be able to speak with you. And can we just begin, before we hear a bit from the book, with the kind of simplest but most difficult of questions? What attracted you to the reign of Henry I?
Yes. Well, thank you, first of all, for that lovely introduction, Stuart. And I would like to say, put on record, how upset I am that I'm not in Wigtown, because it's one of the great festivals and it's got a huge, everybody knows the reputation of it among the authors. And I was really looking forward to being there. But Henry I, I've always found fascinating. I was lucky enough to read history at Oxford quite a long time ago. And I found my old books on him. Actually, they're in this room here. From my study in the early 80s. And he's just a great king. There are aspects of the great medieval kings that we obviously find very distasteful, because to be successful, they tended to be pretty cruel by our standards. But it was, I think, often a necessary cruelty to stay alive and on the throne. And he was a highly intelligent man. He was, less attractively, an opportunist of note. He seized the throne of England when it really wasn't his. He seized it from his eldest brother, this sort of forgotten figure of history, Robert Curthose. Robert was the eldest son of William the Conqueror, and Henry was the fourth and youngest son. And, it was this sort of pivotal time. In terms of your introduction, you're spot on. People don't know about this period. They know of 1066, which actually is why I started the book pretty much with that, because you want to give I'm writing general history for the sort of popular reader, as it were. I'm not writing it for academics. My job is to get the facts straight, but then to drive the narrative. So I give the reader that, because I'm delighted to have it in there too. I need something to hang my hat on. And then, to bring back these huge characters, these massive figures from a forgotten period, that's really what I like doing. I tend to choose periods which I think, who cares about my opinion, but that I think have been wrongly forgotten. And I'm just of that generation where, my early historical studies were very, very early. At my primary school, we looked at this incredibly un-PC book called Our Island Story, which was a drums and trumpets celebration of Britain and how marvelous it was, from Boadicea to the death of Queen Victoria. And intriguingly, I looked it up the other day because I thought, when did I first learn about the White Ship? And it must have been in Our Island Story, because the chapter on Henry I is 2/3 on the sinking of the White Ship and its ramifications. So, we're talking today about a forgotten period, but as you know as a writer, that things go in and out of fashion so much, and particularly with historical study and teaching. This is completely off the radar now. And I thought, this is my chance. It's the 900th anniversary of the sinking this autumn. And if I don't bring it up now, then I'll never get the chance to do it. Of course, publishers love an anniversary too.
I'd like you to read a bit from the book, and it is very skillfully done that you begin, in a way, as Horace said, in media res. You know, we begin with the sinking. Then it has to scroll back to 1066 and the invasion, and you go forward to that dreadful internecine war between Stephen and Henry's daughter, Matilda. So can we just hear a bit? And you do conjure it so well. It'd be lovely for our viewers to hear this.
Well, that's very kind. So this is the prologue of the book. And just, I want people to realize that not everything's as florid as this. With a prologue, you're allowed to be a bit more, well, attempt to be poetical. But anyway, this does hopefully set the scene. Looking back on this, a night whose repercussions would change Europe's history forever, some claim to remember nothing more than a distant noise. It had skimmed across the surface of the icy sea, the sound waves amplified by the stillness of the water, their notes hammered taut by the frost of a late November night. It caught in the northerly wind and perhaps reached the ears of those awake on King Henry I's ship, a dozen nautical miles ahead in the voyage across the Channel. Those who claimed to have heard it in the dark would admit that they had no idea what it was. It was shrill and short-lived, like the distant squawk of a passing gull. The same noise had made it back to shore only a mile away, in a clearer form. Some in the Norman harbour of Barfleur heard it. They were near the point where they had earlier watched the port's finest vessel, the White Ship, cast off into the night. Her departure had attracted a crowd. Some present were related to those on board and had come to say their farewells, while others were intrigued by the glamour and power of those putting out to sea. These passengers included Henry I's sole legitimate son, William, the 17-year-old heir to the Kingdom of England and to the Duchy of Normandy. Two of the king's many illegitimate children, who were openly acknowledged and loved by him, were also aboard the White Ship. With the trio of royal children sailed much of the flower of the Anglo-Norman aristocracy, as well as leading bureaucrats who made Henry's realm run smoothly, and celebrated knights who kept the peace while protecting its borders. The distinguished passengers had spent much of the afternoon and evening in the harbour, drinking hard and encouraging the crew to join in the revelry. Those in Barfleur who heard the noise assumed the merriment was reaching a crescendo on the White Ship out at sea, and they headed for the warmth of home, unsurprised and unconcerned by the cry in the dark. In fact, what these witnesses to history had heard, at sea and on land, was a collective scream for help. The passengers of the White Ship had gone from wild festivity to dire panic in an instant, when they realized the crunch that had brought the vessel to a grinding halt was a rock that had pierced the timbers, leaving a gaping hole and allowing water to pour in. This caused the White Ship to heave to one side, making her spill her human cargo into the shockingly cold sea. Perhaps the lowliest of those on board was Barreau, a butcher from Rouen who had pursued his social superiors onto the ship, determined to get his outstanding bills settled. Barreau clung to part of the White Ship's mast. Then, despite the weight of his saturated goatskin tunic, he hauled himself from the freezing waves onto this life-saving perch. Next to him clambered Geoffrey de l'Aigle, a nobleman who was one of the king's illustrious knights. This unlikely pair had rescued themselves from drowning, but now they lay vulnerable to the extreme cold. They shivered uncontrollably. In the moonlight, they watched as their companions cried out and thrashed in the water, desperate for life. Barreau would later note William, the prince, getting safely away in the White Ship's small boat. The quick-thinking royal bodyguards had bundled him into it and were rowing hard for land, aware that their sole duty in this unfurling disaster was to preserve the life of the king-to-be. They'd even left the royal treasure chest behind in the White Ship's hold. As William headed quickly to safety, Barreau and de l'Aigle watched with mounting horror as the tragedy around them played out. So that's the scene I set at the beginning, because I assume that pretty much nobody knows what the White Ship was among my readers, you know. And you have to give them a taste. You have to tell them, why does it matter, the White Ship, you know? And by telling them who's on board, it brings them into the relevance of the tale.
And it's that lovely detail of the butcher being there, trying to get his money paid back to him. And you realise that, almost the entire elite is going down with the ship. And yet it's the common person who manages to survive. And I think you do that very skillfully, not to make it sentimental. I mean, he's not there for any kind of generous reason. But to scroll back a little bit, Henry I, as you said, the fourth child of William the Conqueror, never thought he'd be king. He's the third surviving child.
Uh-huh.
How did he manage to create the situation, create the sort of dynamic whereby he becomes the king in England, whereas his brothers are left with thin pickings in Normandy and in the rest of France?
Yes. It's very interesting, you see. You have to go back to William the Conqueror, and William was such a domineering figure. And he's rather like an old stag with a young buck. He finds it very difficult to contemplate his eldest son, Robert Curthose, who we briefly met earlier in this conversation. Robert was much mocked by his father. For a start, he had very short legs, and Curthose was a sort of Anglo-French mockery of this physical state created by the father for the son. And then when William the Conqueror gambled everything by trying to take England in 1066, he left his eldest son, Robert Curthose, with the notional title of sort of co-Duke of Normandy, really. It was in case something went wrong, in case he didn't return from this venture into England. And this gave Robert a taste. He wanted more power. But William was not up for that at all. He was very happy controlling England and Normandy himself. And he kept telling Robert Curthose, essentially he said, just back down. Your time will come, but don't push me for more power when I'm not prepared to give it to you. And this sparked a civil war between William the Conqueror and his son, Robert, in Normandy. Now, quite an interesting theme in this book is how incredibly powerful the aristocracy and the bishops were at this time. They could really, if they united, they could dictate policy to whoever was on the throne. And when William the Conqueror was dying after receiving an incredibly dangerous wound in his stomach from the pommel of his saddle hitting his very large stomach and rupturing it, the Baron said to William, you may be at war with your elder son, Robert, but we want him to be Duke of Normandy because that keeps us safe. It keeps our estates in place. We don't want a civil war. William reluctantly agreed to that, but he said, well, I won England by myself, so I'll give that to who I want. And he gives it to his favorite son, who's called William as well, known as William Rufus to history, who's pretty rough, really. He's a very sort of plain-speaking, promiscuous soldier. And I think part of the reason, apart from the favoritism, William the Conqueror wanted his most able military son to have England because he might have held on to it. And then there's another son who dies in a hunting accident. Hunting was clearly very dangerous at the time because quite a few of the protagonists of this tale end up dead in the hunting field. And then the fourth son, Henry, I think it seems was destined for the church. Quite a distinguished career in the church, I imagine. But he was able to read, and at the deathbed scene, William the Conqueror gives him a lot of silver, no land, just sort of lots of money. And Henry complains, even though he's a young boy, as a young man, he says, this is very unfair. What am I going to do with just money? I need status, I need land. And William the Conqueror said, one day you'll be greater than both your brothers. And there was a lot of jealousy between the surviving three sons of William the Conqueror. And Henry was treated appallingly. He was imprisoned by brothers. He was stripped of his land by them. And he basically took his vengeance on both of them. In 1100, he was in the hunting field in the New Forest when William Rufus was shot in the chest. We're not sure quite by whom. There are a couple of names who it's possible to be. Anyway, Henry was there while his brother died, and he left William Rufus to stiffen in death on the ground while he galloped off first to Winchester to get the treasury of England, and then on to London to be crowned at Westminster Abbey. And then he wasn't content with that. He was looking at Normandy with a keen eye as well. And he watched as Robert Curthose was a terrible Duke of Normandy and could not impose order. Everyone was living in terror because of a form of anarchy, really. And Henry, on this day, actually, this is the anniversary, but this day in September in 1106, Robert Curthose was defeated at a totally obscure battle from history's point of view called Tinchebray in France. And after that, Henry I, out of nowhere, was King of England and Duke of Normandy. And that's really the driving force of Henry's life after that, was to make his son, William, who we met briefly in the epilogue, getting away on the ship, on the little boat, to hand over his twin realms to him. That was his driving force.
Before we go on to William Atheling, Curthose comes across as a very strange character in the book. You have a lovely anecdote towards the end about him when he's imprisoned by his own brother, learning Welsh and writing poetry, which, we tend to think that Robert Curthose and William Rufus are a bit dim compared to Henry.
Yes.
And yet it seems there was a certain soulfulness about Curthose. I suppose prison might do that to somebody.
So Curthose is a fascinating mix because I've already mentioned how appalling he was as Duke of Normandy, but he was one of the great figures of the First Crusade, and he brought huge credit to himself and Normandy through his conduct as one of the leading Christian generals. But otherwise, he was just a huge disappointment. I think he was a bit thick, and also he had no concept of money. And this was something Henry had a very clear view of what money was about. When he got his inheritance, Henry I, it was a certain amount of silver. He had it weighed there and then before he took it away. Henry I went on to found the Exchequer in England, and he took coinage very seriously. So if anybody adulterated the very high quality of coin in England, they were deprived of their right hand and their genitals. So he took it seriously. Robert Curthose was less focused, and they said that he had no concept of anything's value. And, even down to, he didn't know how much a horse or a hound should cost. So even in his pastimes, he had no idea. And he attracted a lot of sycophants. And he thought that to keep them on side, he had to reward them. So he splurged money on them and was living hand to mouth. By the time Henry came to essentially invade Normandy and take it off him, his troops were living hand to mouth, Curthose. They had no provisions. They had to just sort of forage and get what they could. Whereas Henry was very efficient. He had set in place these very clear rewards. Depending on your rank, you got paid X. You did not despoil areas that you were campaigning in or whatever. Everything was paid for. Very organized, very modern way of thinking. And then William Rufus is just a complete oaf, to be honest, and fascinating nonetheless for that. Massively promiscuous, bisexual, promiscuous, and good soldier. He was a good soldier, but the rest of the time he was at daggers drawn with the church, the Welsh, the Scots. He was just a fighter, a bruiser. And Henry was much more considered, much more tactical, a colder and more analytical mind than that of his two brothers.
How much did the fact that Henry had been almost groomed for the church play into that? That he'd been given a kind of education that his brothers both lacked?
I think you hit on something very interesting there, because the other brothers weren't educated. The other two brothers were just educated in war. And William the Conqueror wasn't an intellectual. He did try. He put aside some time to learn English, but he couldn't manage it. And, he was busy in the battlefield, and Henry had what we would consider a more academic mind. And we know there's some wonderful descriptions of Henry I's court once he was an established King of England. And he did the business of monarchy in the morning, the actual governance, the ruling, etc. But in the afternoon, he liked to have a more relaxed time, and some of it was spent in intellectual conversation. I mean, he was known as Beauclerk. This was a sort of nickname for being super intelligent. He wasn't super intelligent by our standards, I don't think, in that he could read, but he couldn't write. But he was very, very much more educated than most royal and high aristocrat of contemporaries were. They got a very minimal cerebral introduction to life.
One of the things in the book which struck me, and it's the way that you can use a small detail to tease out a much bigger story, is how Henry is very modest in terms of his feasting, certainly compared to his brothers. And that struck me as being rather strange and perhaps a bit of a key into his character, that he was the one who wasn't going to get drunk. He wasn't going to be like Henry VIII later on, just tearing off bits of a chicken leg. And I wonder if you could just say a wee bit about that. Was that parsimony, or was it
I think it
kind
was
of monastic?
I think it was discipline. Because he had the option to be a sort of bloated. I love, you talk about the details. I mean, one of the things I really love is learning about William the Conqueror's massive descent into obesity. And there's a scene at William the Conqueror's funeral where the stone sarcophagus
This is awful.
he's going to be in for the rest of his life, was carved for him when he was a svelte warrior. Well, when he turned up, his corpse arrived at the cathedral, and the monks sort of pushed and squeezed and couldn't get it in. And eventually, William's guts burst open, and he had died quite a long time before. The stench was so terrible that people ran from the service, and it was a few loyal monks who saw through the actual the burial ceremony. But going back to Henry, I think a lot of it is discipline. His financial discipline was extraordinary. And I think he was one of these, control freak is probably too modern a concept, but he was very busy and businesslike. His right-hand man when he was King of England was Roger of Salisbury, and Henry had found him just a simple country pastor in Normandy. But what attracted Henry to him was that he could get a mass done in a very short time. And Henry I was an impatient man. He wanted to be hunting, or he wanted to be in the battlefield. And he didn't have time for long drawn-out services. And then he realized he was very good at picking people, actually. He didn't trust the aristocracy because they were a threat to him. And, to begin with, they underestimated him. And then once they got the measure of the man, they realized that Henry was a significant power, and they would unite with perhaps the King of France or the Count of Anjou to try and attack Henry. And I think there's something about Henry that was just a very disciplined, clever man who structured his life. The exchequer was not brought about by chance. He knew he needed finance to underpin all the things he wanted to do. And he essentially, the exchequer was almost like an abacus on a large table with a checkerboard cloth. And if you think back to, anyone under 50 will not understand this, but before decimalisation, doing maths in pounds, shillings, and pence was really tricky. So you needed a system to do this. We're not dealing in tens and hundreds. You're dealing in 12s and 2.5s and things like that. And so he devised a system whereby in the open, his sheriffs from the counties of England would have to come and account for the money they owed the crown twice a year. And if it was short, they were told to make it up and get it done. Before, it had all been a bit casual. And I think possibly the parsimony you refer to, or the abstemiousness or whatever, is all part of the man. Yeah, he was disciplined.
In terms of the opening of the book, when you talk about the sinking of the White Ship, and William is one of two children from Henry's first marriage. He has many, many more. I think, was it 24 or 22 that were
well, you're right.
born?
He has 24 children, of which 22 are illegitimate. Do you know what I like about it? Of course, that's slightly sexually incontinent. We have to give him that. But what I like about the man is that he claimed them. Quite often at this time, royalty and aristocracy would pretend they didn't remember the affair or the night or whatever it was. But Henry was quite a generous man in spirit and also very practical. He used his children. He married one to your Prince of Galloway, you know, because he wanted to control southwestern Scotland. And he really used them diplomatically. Now, of course, that's always been the case for kings and queens, but he was very clever. And he would marry off these royal bastards, as I suppose they are, to not particularly powerful people, but on the checkerboard of European diplomacy, they closed up some tricky gaps. And he had a very clear view of what was needed. But you're right. The elder legitimate child was his daughter, Matilda, who's again, you talked in your intro about the nearly kings of Britain or England. Although I loved how you called James I James VI. I'll give you that. But the Matilda was a nearly queen. And it's incredible. There are so many powerful women in this story. And Matilda would have been, I think, an excellent queen. She had shown herself. She was married off as a child to essentially the emperor of Central Europe, what would in later generations be called the Holy Roman Emperor, controlling from what is now...
Holy Roman Empire, as they used to say.
That's right. That's it. And she married him, and, you know, I'm sure it wasn't a marriage with much love in it or whatever, but she was a very dutiful empress, although she was never actually crowned that. But when her husband was away, she was very capable, and she oversaw judgments and was a recognized force in her own right. But when it came to being Queen of England, I'm afraid no one was up for that. You know, although I don't know how much we're going to do a spoiler alert on this. I think we've already accepted that William's drowning. So when she's the only legitimate child left, Henry, first of all, decides to remarry. He's a widower. He remarries to try and have another legitimate male heir, because illegitimate children were not considered liable for inheritance at this stage. A recent invention, because William the Conqueror had been illegitimate when he became Duke of Normandy. But the church had made big headway, and they'd made that impossible. So after Henry failed to have any more legitimate children, which nobody really, I mean, in that he was so fertile, we're not sure what happened, whether he had impotence, had gone sterile, or was depressed, or whatever it was. But we do know his second wife, Adeliza of Louvain. We know two things about her. One, she was very beautiful. She was sort of famously beautiful, known as the Fair Maid of Brabant. And secondly, that after Henry's death, she remarried and had half a dozen children. So there was nothing wrong with her ability to reproduce. Anyway, as Henry pushed into his late 50s, he realized he probably wasn't going to have any more children. And he made the barons and the bishops swear in front of him, 7 miles from where I'm sitting in Northampton Castle, made them swear that they would acknowledge Matilda as his successor. And they all did this. They raced to do it. In fact, the first person to do it was King David of Scotland, who was Matilda's uncle. And then, I don't know, when it came to it, I think the concept of a queen ruling in her own right was just too much for people to handle. And I of course, there's terrible prejudice about gender. There's also a practical element, which I came across, which is nobody could conceive of a woman leading men into battle. And this was a very big part of being a monarch in the early 12th century.
Yes, and yet it's so strange that if you were talking about the great monarchs of the previous centuries, you know, we'd be looking at Elizabeth I, Victoria, and Elizabeth II. So Absolutely. The idea of female monarchy is actually something that perhaps they could have used at that time. I wanted to ask, in terms of William who dies on the White Ship, William Etheling, do you think he would have been a good king? Or is that kind of rambunctious behaviour when they're all getting slightly plastered before trying to cross the channel? Would he have been a good king, or would he have just been a disappointment to his father?
It's a good question. So William dies age 17. So I think we have to be fair on him for that, because if I look back on my teens, they weren't my finest moment. But he did have a very strange view of his future subjects, you see, and that worries me. If I look back on it, he had a mother who was from Scotland, a princess of Scotland who was of English ancestry, actually. And one of the attractions of her being Henry I's wife was that she took the bloodline back to Alfred the Great. But so he was meant to bring together the Norman invader and the ancient Anglo-Saxon world through into one line again and bind up the wounds of the conquest. But to be honest, he had a very clear view, very unpleasantly clear view, that the Normans were the superior race. And as soon as he was going to be king, he was going to make sure the Anglo-Saxons were tied to the yoke like oxen, as he said it. And also, I tell you, one of the things, Stuart, I came across, I'm not a medievalist, so this was new territory for me. And I spent a year reading everything I could about this period just to get my head around it. It's a big jump from part of a degree in 1984 or whatever I did to writing a proper book. And what I realized was that, 90% of the sources, probably nearer 100, they're from religious people, you see. And the fact that William died on this ship, the monk historians looked for a reason. Why would God decide to kill him? That's the prison they came through. So they amplified his worst faults. And yes, he was a sort of, an objectionable hooray Henry in our world, and the drunkenness and the calamity. He tempted God's judgment on the night that the ship was going to set off from Barfleur Harbour. Not only was everyone drunk, when the monks came to bless the White Ship, it was a prestigious vessel with an incredibly important human cargo, and people were terrified of the sea at this time. The monks came to give God's blessing, and William's friends chased them away, and that was seen to be incredibly, you were inviting calamity by doing that. So what do we know about him from eyewitness accounts? We know that I think he was a handsome man, although I have to say everyone seems to be handsome or beautiful if they were royal or a high aristocrat. The monks conferred that on them. It can't have been possible. But he was considered by the monks to be sort of very handsome, blonde, perfect prince to look at. Bit too interested in fine clothes, and inevitably attracted pretty appalling sycophants. And they were all huddled on the boat with, they're on the White Ship with him, so they got their comeuppance. And I wonder, I think if we extrapolate further, imagine if the future Henry V had died as a teenager, we'd have thought, well, thank goodness for that. What a wastrel, hanging out with Falstaff and all that. And so maybe the becoming king would have been the making of the boy, so we don't know, but have to be wary of the sources because they wanted to see this as a divine judgment, this sinking.
It may be something we come to later, but I was very impressed by your use of the medieval sources. I mean, there's not many people that read Malmesbury these days.
Well, I must say, it's a real challenge because I decided, all my books take 3 years because that's what happens. Each one's rather like doing a degree, actually. And then, but with this one, I thought, right, I really have to make sure of what's what. And so for a year, I just read all the sources. And you think, my goodness, this world is mad because everything, that there isn't a single thing that is allowed to go without God's hand on it. So the day that William Rufus gets shot in the New Forest, the chroniclers write, and the ground bubbled up in Reading with blood. And you think, well, it didn't, it didn't. But, because it was such a catastrophe losing a king, you have to put a flourish in that God has sent these harbingers of doom. So I thought, my goodness, because I'm quite light on the religious side. I respect people's religion, but it doesn't drive me in my life. So as somebody who's quite a relaxed Anglican, you can't get more relaxed than that in a religious setting. And basically, I was having to get my mindset into that of fanatical monks. You know, it's really extraordinary. My previous 3 books were on the Civil War, and I got that. I learned to interpret the sort of over-the-top propaganda of the royalists or parliamentarians, you know, and you steer a middle course, and you hope you find 2 sources, because there's an enormous amount of pamphlets from the Civil War, so I could balance that. And here was so interesting. My main source is this fantastic man. I'd love to have met him. An English boy who was sent by his rather stern father off for the rest of his life to go and be a monk in Normandy. The father considered sending his son, Orderic Vitalis, great name, off abroad, because he thought, well, whatever agony the family has to suffer from separation would be compensated because God would bless them and they'd all go to heaven. So that was the trade-off. But Orderic Vitalis, although he's based in Normandy, becomes the historian of his abbey. And there are huge chunks about abbot, whatever, and that's fine. But what he's really interested in is the adventure and anything that's to do with England, because although he's been translated to Normandy, he signs himself Orderic the Englishman. And he was really intrigued by anything to do with Henry I, the king at that time. And he's particularly mesmerized by the story of the White Ship, which makes him a fantastic source. And I maintain, in my own mind, I would never, there is no evidence of this. There's no direct evidence of this, that Barrow the Butcher, who we know lived for 20 years after the shipwreck, lived not a million miles from, we know where Orderic went on his travels from the monastery. And I'm convinced that he met him, because the eyewitness account in Orderic Vitalis is so unbelievable. Well, not unbelievable, it's so credible because of the details. And Orderic Vitalis actually mentions, about Barrow living on. And I think that's a hint that he managed to catch up with him. And it's mesmerizing to read, the minute detail of what happened when the shipwreck happened. It's extraordinary. And they were very intelligent men, God-fearing to the point of fanaticism, but the intelligence of William of Malmesbury, one of the greatest historians England's ever produced, writing at the same period.
Yes, and it's particularly when you're talking about people like Anselm, the way in which the papacy was involved in all of this. And they play a real game of cat and mouse. I mean, particularly Henry, trying to find a way to negotiate this power, which is not a land power, has no army, but has people in every single parish in the country. How did he negotiate the papacy? Because he could very well have been excommunicated.
Yeah, Henry was very intelligent. So I touched on earlier how William Rufus had a total disregard for the church. And William Rufus, I don't think, was that bothered by sincere Christian belief. So what he saw the church as this incredibly handy financial resource. And if you look at Domesday Book, the great land roll call, the land roll call of the 1080s, the church owned a quarter of England. And William Rufus realized that if he left archbishoprics and bishoprics vacant, he could scoop up the revenue for the crown. And this resulted in huge problems with the papacy. The papacy, since the mid-1070s, have been re-establishing control. I believe one of the reasons that the First Crusade happened was because the Pope Urban wanted to bring the sort of lay leaders of Christendom under his banner again. And so you have William Rufus, who didn't give a fig for the Pope, and Anselm, you brought up, who's this very spiritual, monk-like figure from what is now the Italian Alps, ends up in England during William Rufus's terrible reign, where he's despoiling the churches, really. And William Rufus gets ill, very bad stomach disease, and he's whisked off to Gloucester Cathedral, where the monks are good. They have a medical knowledge. And they persuade him that he's dying because God is punishing him for his unchristian ways. And William Rufus, mildly practical, I suppose, thinks, well, I'm about to meet my maker. I'd better be more Christian. So he quickly summons Anselm and says, I would like you to be Archbishop of Canterbury. Anselm comes on board on the condition that he can be properly effective as a Christian leader and that William Rufus will respect the church and respect Anselm. William Rufus unexpectedly recovers from his deathbed, supposed deathbed, and then finds he's shackled to Anselm, who he massively falls out with, exiles him, and Henry is a genius because as soon as he becomes king, he woos Anselm back. He realizes he needs all the help he can get, and he manages to get the blessing of the Archbishop, who then becomes a very useful go-between between Henry I and the Pope. And while a lot of other European kings and the emperor are trying to find a way of balancing the power between being a king and being allowed to appoint bishops, and the Pope insisting that he can appoint abbots and bishops alone, Henry I comes to a very pragmatic compromise, which is, yes, the Pope can appoint the leaders of the church, but they must also swear homage to Henry because they're also great landowners. So therefore, the king needs their homage too. It's a very effective compromise. It takes other people a decade or two to work out the thing that Henry has cracked straight away. So yeah, the Pope's very powerful, increasingly powerful, and Henry manages to knock him out as a potential opponent.
Before we go to questions from the audience, the one thing which is almost at the centre of the book is a father grieving a son. What do you think the psychological impact of the death of William was? And what do you think the psychological impact was of William Atheling's cousin, who's out there as a potential threat, you know, somebody who could well be a pretender to the throne? How did that impact on Henry himself?
Well, unusually, and of course this sounds very odd, unusually, Henry really loved his children. And it was quite normal for a king of England to just have the children out of duty and then sort of leave them to their own devices in a way. But we know from letters Henry wrote how much he loved his children. He was devastated. So nobody dared tell Henry I that he had lost not only his only legitimate son, but two other children and other relations and all the great men and 18 women of countess rank and above. They all went down on the White Ship. For 2 days, people mooched around grieving their own loss, you know, that the elite had lost so many and there was barely anyone untouched by the wreckage. So they kept away from him because they didn't want Henry to see them grieving because then he'd ask them what the problem was. And in the end, a little boy, a page boy, was told to go and give the news. And he blurts it out to Henry. And Henry receives this devastating news of the White Ship and bellows and keels over. And he is inconsolable for quite some time. I don't think he ever got over it. I think he was depressed, clinically depressed for the remaining 15 years of his life, which may have something to do with him not being able to father another child in the wedlock. But on top of that, he couldn't, he was a chancer. He knew he was an opportunist who had seized one throne and then seized the dukedom. And what had he done it for if it wasn't going to pass on to his son, as it mattered so much in those days? And it was so complicated because at the end of the day, I think he missed his son as a father would intensely, but it also undermined the entire purpose of his reign. You mentioned the...
allows William Clito to sort of...
Yeah, there is a pretender. Yeah, there is a pretender.
Election in the Holds.
And he's clearly a very charismatic man. He is the son of Robert Curthose, another William Clito, as you say. And he is the great hope of all of Henry's enemies. King Louis the Fat of France, the Count of Anjou, the Count of Maine, all these people want to support William Clito, this pretender, because it's a way of tackling Henry I's enormous power. So yeah, it's a fascinating, these characters, I mean, I loved learning about them. It's been actually, I have to say, before we go to questions, whenever that is, what a privilege it was to get to know these people, because they are huge characters and worth bringing back, I think.
You mentioned there that you have previously written about the Civil War, but one question has come through from the audience saying, are you now a medievalist? And having tackled this book, will you be doing another about another medieval book?
Well, I do enjoy the medieval period, but I'm very aware I'm not a medievalist, even down to the fact, actually, after I'd written it, I was happy with the words, as it were, but I chose to get one of the top medieval academics in Cambridge to read it through, to check I hadn't made sort of howling mistakes. So no, I'm not a medievalist. I wish I was. I think I'm too old to switch as well. I mean, I love aspects. So Henry II, the sort of denouement of this plot is that Matilda, Henry I's sole remaining legitimate child, fights for England for 19 years against Stephen of Blois. Stephen got off the White Ship before it set sail because he had a stomach upset. The luckiest stomach upset of history, I'd say, because he would have drowned. And after that, there's a compromise. There's sort of grinding civil war, which is an absolute bloodbath, in which the Scots get quite involved too, King David invading on behalf of Matilda. And you end up with this compromise where the heir is Henry II. And I really am intrigued by Henry II because he comes into the end of my book. He's so jealous of the King of Scotland during his time, whose name I sadly forget. And somebody compliments the King of Scotland in front of Henry II, and he flies into such a jealous rage that he starts eating his own mattress. Like, wow, that's someone worth writing about. Talk about, lack of self-control. I find that fascinating, but I don't think it's enough for a book there. Now I'm going to go into pastures new. What I've worked out now is I'm a storyteller, really, and I look for the good stories.
I think that a great many people, if they know anything about this period, will know it from Ellis Peters' novels. I mean, that's how I knew about Matilda and Stephen.
Absolutely.
From the Brother Campbell mysteries. But it is that thing about you find the story and you can bring in all the data and the facts and the interpretation and what we can learn from it afterwards. But you've got to have the story, and certainly eating your mattress is a pretty great one. Now, another question from the audience. Do you think Matilda had the making of a queen, like Elizabeth I, if she could have inherited the crown? Was Matilda knowledgeable enough about politics?
Do you know, I think she was. I think she would have been a great queen. And there's a wonderful book, if anyone's interested, there's a wonderful book, it's 10 years old now, I think, called She Wolves, and it's by a Cambridge academic called Helen Castor. And it's about the women who were queens of England before Elizabeth I. And Matilda is clearly a woman of incredible competence. But she was up against gender bias. I'm sorry, it was that simple. Because if I go through any of the chronicles, there isn't a single time when somebody criticizes William the Conqueror, William Rufus, or Henry I for being arrogant, obnoxious, superior, or any of these qualities. They were all of those things. They were horrifying men. But, Matilda's mildly rude to a couple of people. And in the Chronicles, she's hauled over the coals for being imperious and unfit for the crown. And I'm afraid it's a terrible indictment on 900 years ago. It just wasn't possible to be in England and Normandy. There were other parts of Europe where they did have queens in their own right. For a queen to be respected or accepted. And I think, going to your question, the person who asked the question, I think she was too competent. The three men who saw to her becoming almost queen, she was within touching distance. One was King David of Scotland. One was a great baron who was the Earl of Gloucester, in fact, who was her half-brother. And another was a great bishop. They supported her because they assumed she would let them do the ruling. when she made it clear that she was going to be queen and they would be, you know, much respected advisors, they deserted her. That wasn't the deal at all. And it was the sort of glass ceiling thing. They just couldn't consider this woman really having control over them. They were very important men, and they didn't want this woman telling them what to do.
But how much of this links in with the problems Elizabeth always had, in that Matilda was seen as European. She was seen as somebody who was linked in with a whole network of dynasties within Europe. Now, Elizabeth I very cannily kept out of all that by not marrying. It was possibly her most genius decision, was to keep them all on their toes about who might become the consort. Because at the time, as you say, it was a sexist period, and a wife had to submit to the husband. So if Elizabeth had ended up marrying Philip of Spain, he would have said, right, you know, you're doing that, then the washing.
Yes. You know, it's so interesting. I just don't think, gosh, when was it acceptable? I mean, I can't think of a queen who really ruled in her own right until, Elizabeth, of course, and then you're waiting till Victoria. So it's not something that's popped up very often, is it? It's extraordinary. I mean, in Scotland, you've had very impressive queens, but they've basically been consorts, haven't they? You know, it's a different way of having power. It's subservient.
Indeed, and certainly somebody like Queen Anne.
Yes.
You know, I love that period, and yet it's just such a tragic story.
Well, all her children dying, and I love the description of Queen Anne's husband, Prince George of Denmark, who was clearly really a sweet man, but deeply stupid. And Charles II said about him, "I've tried him drunk and I've tried him sober, and there's nothing in him." And that's awful. That's all I know about Prince George of Denmark.
So another question. You touched a bit on the dynastic relationships between Scotland and England in this period. Are there particularly interesting details that you've come across about the relations between the two kingdoms at this time? And of course, with William the Conqueror, that you get various parts of the English court decamping to Scotland in order to escape the axe, as it were.
Yes. Well, what was interesting to me was that, you know, essentially people saw Scotland as this sort of terrifying northern neighbour that was, they were terrified of invasion because the Scots had a reputation for bloodthirstiness. I'm sure most of it was propaganda, and it was equal. If you'd had people writing in Scotland, you know, there was a problem. But interesting to this particular story is the fact that Henry I realized he had an enormous amount on his plate in mainland Europe. So he had 3 successive brothers-in-law during his reign as kings of Scotland, and he was on good terms with all of them, and that was very clever. You know, one less thing to worry about. He could take his grand army into France and Normandy, knowing things were safe back home. And one of the great figures in this book is King David of Scotland, who grew up as a young man, I think as the 4th son of his father, you know, wasn't expected to be king, just like Henry. And he grew up as a young, almost like a young knight in the English court, and learned a lot about how to conduct himself in battle, etc. And he was very much lent on by Henry I as the great supporter of his daughter when he died. You know, he was a king and he had an army. And I love King David. He's a very organized, interesting guy, deeply, deeply religious. And I get what I didn't actually know until writing this book was how far south the Scots had come. You know, Cumbria and Newcastle, these sort of places, these were in flux. They sometimes English and sometimes Scottish. And King David, because he was so religious, he was very, one of the things that irked him was that there wasn't an archbishop in Scotland at this time. And he had his eye on York, because he thought if he took York, at least he'd get an archbishop in the Scottish realm. But then going slightly off at a tangent, I do like when I'm writing history books to bring other people to life who people think they know. And there is a moment. So Henry I's wife's father, King Malcolm, is involved in the death of Macbeth. And so I have a half a page on the real Macbeth, who was a great king of Scotland. You know, he wasn't the sort of henpecked neurotic of Shakespeare's plays. He was careful about widows' rights and orphans' rights. And he was powerful enough and rich enough to lead a mission to Rome to visit the Pope, where he was considered a great man and gave a lot to the poor. So I do like to try and right the wrongs in my tiny way in my books. And I felt very sorry for Macbeth. Anyway, so those are the things I learned about Scotland that I didn't know. And also, your Gallowesians, as they're called, and the Picts, as they were known, they were considered the really hardcore Scottish fighters. And when they invaded in the 1130s and 1140s, people were incredibly nervous. Unbelievably silly propaganda that they used to drink the blood of English children. Of course, they didn't. But that was what was being put around at the time. But what was impressive was the huge bravery of the Picts in battle. They thought it was a bit soft to wear armor, so they had a pretty heavy casualty rate. But they died very, very bravely, and people they were like dervishes. You know, they would come attacking, even when they were there's eyewitness accounts of them being riddled with arrows, so they looked like porcupines. Was one of the descriptions, but still fighting until they were dead. You know. But they were considered the sort of they're like the Prussians in the German army. They were the sort of warrior race, really, that underpinned the Scots. And I didn't realize. I mean, I'm sure people from Wigtown and the area would know that it was a separate kingdom to the main kingdom of Scotland. So I learned quite a lot about Scotland writing this book.
I'm going to ask one final question before we have to wrap up.
Yeah,
and it's about the whole connection between Normandy and Britain or England. Can you see any way in which the English or the British could have ever held Normandy? Or was it always going to be this slightly problematic area? I mean, right the way through to Henry V. I mean, it's Henry VI that really loses it. But, you know, was Normandy always just a bit of a bust flush?
Owning large territories in what is, if we call it France, today's France, was always going to be problematic in the long term, because at some point you're going to get a very weak English king and a very good French king coinciding. And it was the logistics that were the problem. I mean, even in this time, you have a king as powerful as Henry I was, as wealthy as he was. He was able to buy in mercenaries from Brittany or wherever. He was a very powerful man. But it took all of his nous to stay on top of his his Norman dukedom. And the only reason he could do it was because he had total control back in England. If you had an English king who had problems in England, he was going to have to look after them first. If you had a good French king with a decent army, he could deal with the outposts that the English were controlling. So there had to come a point where things were eroded away, and you end up with, who is it? It's Queen Mary, you know, in the mid-16th century, finally loses Calais. I mean, it was very difficult to supply these places. You know, Calais, a port, could be cut off. To me, it's amazing that the English or the British hung on to territory over there for so long.
That's just one of the things which is so striking about your book. The White Ship by Charles Spencer is an astonishing piece of work. It certainly shines a light into a bit of history which few of us know about, but also there is a human aspect to it in terms of how these people were reacting to events they could never have predicted. I think it's a commendable book. Please use the Wigtown Bookshop to buy your copy. And Charles, just thank you very much indeed.
Stuart, what a brilliant interview you are. I want to take you everywhere. Thank you. And Wigtown, I want to come to you. Next time I have a book out, I'll come and do this in person.
Well, sooner than 3 years then.
Okay, yes, exactly. Thank you so much anyway.
Thank you.